Good evening. My name is Eduardo Galvan, Regional Superintendent for the Southwest Region. I wanted to welcome you all to our FY25 budget outreach meeting. I would like to pause and allow our interpreters to provide a very important message regarding our interpretation services.
Buenas noches y bienvenidos a esta reunión sobre el presupuesto. Ustedes van a poder acceder a esta reunión en español completamente. Dentro de poco ustedes van a ver un globo. En ese globo van a poder seleccionar el idioma español para que puedan escuchar toda esta reunión en español. Muchas gracias y nuevamente bienvenidos.
Thank you. And once again, my name is Eduardo Galvan, Regional Superintendent for the Southwest Region. I'd like to pause to allow my other panel members to introduce themselves.
Good evening. I'm Chris Thiel. I'm the head of governmental relations for Milwaukee Public Schools.
Hello, and I am Nick Sinram, Director of Financial Planning and Budget Services.
Hello, I'm Martha Kreitzman, Chief Financial Officer.
I'm Nicole Armendariz, and I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing.
Good evening. I'm Sean Kane, the Senior Director for Department of Facilities and Maintenance Services.
Thank you. And once again, thank you to everybody who is with us tonight as we prepare to share information with you regarding our fiscal year 25 budget. This is the second of 3 meetings. We had an online meeting earlier today, and obviously we are meeting tonight, and we have an in-person meeting this coming Saturday, December 16th at Milwaukee High School of the Arts, located at 2300 West Highland Avenue, and that will be, again, in person from 10 to 11 a.m. The purpose of our meeting today is, again, to begin preliminary discussions regarding our fiscal year 25 budget. The slide that you are looking at currently shows our 5 priorities for success, which are increasing academic achievement and accountability, improve district and school culture, develop our staff, ensure fiscal responsibility and transparency, and strengthen communication and collaboration. Our focus tonight will be on ensuring fiscal responsibility and transparency and strengthening communication and collaboration. Next slide, please. Also, this slide represents our Milwaukee Public School Strategic Plan. In addition to the 5 priorities for success, the work we are doing is aligned to the MPS 5-year strategic plan. Much of what is being discussed today, as well as other efforts to best serve students, families, and the community, are being addressed by projects outlined in our 2023-28 strategic plan process. Next slide, please. As we go through this today, again, I wanted to just establish some norms. We are asking that if you have any questions or want to provide feedback, that you do so in the chat. There is also an email link that will be shared where you can certainly share information in that manner. And we also have a survey, which you will have a QR code to at the end of the presentation. Again, we will be presenting information, and we would like your feedback to help us guide our next steps. Again, we ask that anything that we didn't answer immediately, we will provide in a frequently asked question format, which will be placed on our webpage. So please plan on sharing all of those with us today. I'm excited to say that our earlier presentation, we had over 100 participants, and they did share much of that through our survey. But again, there is an email option and in the chat as well. Our plan today is to complete the presentation, and if the time allows, there will be some opportunities for comments and questions at the end of the slideshow. We ask that everyone remain productive, polite, and respectful in their feedback, and be mindful to provide realistic, usable input to help with decision-making process as we present this information. Again, this is a webinar, so we won't be able to listen to your your voices, but we can certainly read what is put in the chat and in those other venues as I described. This slide just outlines our agenda for today. We'll begin with an overview of school funding in Wisconsin, what this means for Milwaukee Public Schools, and what we will do to balance those revenues against our expenditures. And now it is my great pleasure to again introduce Mr. Chris Thiel, who will lead us forward.
Thank you, Mr. Galvan, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Again, my name is Chris Thiel. I'm the head of our governmental relations area for Milwaukee Public Schools. And if you've been able to join us for any of our school board meetings over the last year, or frankly, maybe beyond that, some of this information may be familiar to you. We know that in years past, when we've started these budget discussions, we've attempted to make it to different parts of the city before an era where we had, online ability like this. So we're happy that people are able to join us this evening to find out a little bit more about kind of the state budget and what that means for our budget as we look toward the 24-25 school year. So I'm going to walk through some of the detail, and I know some of this can get complicated. The effort here is going to be give you enough specifics so that you kind of had an understanding of where some of these fiscal elements come from, but really hopefully zoom back out to give you the broad picture of what's been happening with funding in the state of Wisconsin. And one of the key terms that we use when we talk about Wisconsin school funding is revenue limits. And frankly, it just kind of means what it says. It's a limit on revenue imposed by the state and a limit on revenue that is available for us to use to support our students. The revenue limit era started in the 1993-95 state budget process. And really at that time, it was an effort to limit property tax increases. So sometimes people say we really in Wisconsin have kind of a property tax limitation system that masquerades as a school funding system. And we've been working through it ever since that time. And one of the key pieces of information as we talk this evening, seen there in that third bullet point, is that when this system was created, there were a number of other elements that went along with it, state aid and some other things, but the revenue limits were supposed to at least be adjusted to keep pace with inflation. So I think commonly people say the word increase, but the language applied here really is adjustment, because we're really talking only about revenues that kept pace with inflation. So there weren't any increases above that inflationary adjustment over that period of time. We can go to the next slide. So that's kind of one of our main points of emphasis here. We're going to talk to you about those revenue limits and what's changed in terms of the revenue limit versus the real rate of inflation. And then the other major piece of funding that we're going to highlight tonight is in a section of state funding that's called categorical aids. And these are aids to support students in particular areas, categories. That's why they're called that. And one of the major ones is special education, which you may have heard us talking about over time, because the state unfortunately has gone from supporting that area fairly well to we're now at a pretty low point of state support for students with disabilities. So we can walk you through those categories, and I'll touch on a few more. But again, just kind of zooming back and taking a look, and if you said what's been happening with state funding, and really kind of put us in a multi-year context to gain an understanding of what all school districts across the state have been dealing with. As I said at the beginning there, we had a system where the revenue limits at least kept pace with inflation. And that relationship ended when we were all hit with a great recession. And so when that hit around that 2009-10 moment there, all of a sudden we had per pupil amount decoupled from and lagging behind keeping pace with inflation. So, year after year over time here, school districts have been trying to make do. And again, if you just think about your own budgets, if you were only receiving a per pupil adjustment that kept pace with inflation, you kind of think about that as just keeping your head above water, even when there were some other expenses coming into play. So for those of you who may have joined us in budget meetings prior to 2008-9, you know that funding at the beginning of the 2000s was already difficult. But when we had this separation of at least getting a per pupil adjustment that keeps pace with inflation, things year after year after year accumulate, and you really need to talk about school funding in this broad, 16 years here. And just to give you some context, in 2023, the statewide, the class of 2023 graduates never had a moment in their school career where the state actually provided our students per pupil funding that kept pace with inflation. So if you just think about a child entering K4, graduating high school this year, that's the amount of time that we have not had adjustments to keep pace with inflation. So that's the broad context. So we can give you some closer detail here, I think, in the next slide. So just for those of you who are maybe paying attention to the state budget over this last year, the state does a 2-year budget, a biennial budget, it's called, and we put in place funding amounts for both the 23-24 school year and then the 24-25 school year. So the state makes its decision about how to fund those 2 years, and that has already taken place and was finalized in July of this year. And you may have heard that we're getting $325 per pupil, but the fact of the matter is, although obviously that's better than nothing, if you put it again in those inflationary terms and in that context, this year, as we showed you that trajectory in the last slide, we actually, all school districts again, actually needed about $390 per pupil just to keep on pace with inflation. And so although 325, is certainly better than nothing, it's still $65, $66 below that pace of inflation trajectory. And again, that pace of inflation policy was instituted under Tommy Thompson. So this is not something that, really was controversial. It was simply, yeah, we should keep pace with inflation to support our students. And we can see the next slide. This detail here, again, these numbers are all part of that original line graph we showed you, but we're just going into a little bit more detail here. What you're seeing here is in these 2 years, and this was unprecedented. Nobody, frankly, predicted that this would happen. It hadn't happened before. But kind of during the height of COVID, the state legislature, instead of providing any amount per pupil of adjustment, provided nothing. So we had 2 years in a row, actually, of zero. And this coincided with COVID and some of the other, financial stuff that was going on. But again, just fundamentally, in terms of a state keeping its commitment to kids, keeping its commitment to at least revenues that keep pace with inflation, and sometimes you hear schools should be more like business. I think any business would tell you that, if you don't have revenues that keep pace with inflation, your business isn't going to end up that great. And what was happening also in this time is certainly, you had an unprecedented pandemic. You had federal money that came into the mix that was supposed to be focused solely in supporting districts during that time and with the extra costs associated with a global pandemic. But the understanding was that, states would at least continue to do their part to keep the per pupil funding moving forward. So if you deviate from any inflationary increase, if you flatline funding in these 2 years, you're heading toward a situation where, from a state supporting schools perspective, we're getting further and further away from what's needed. And we know that those federal dollars were one-time dollars. They don't sustain programs into the future. So we really needed this sustainable, predictable funding from the state over this period of time. Next slide, please. So again, dove into some of that detail, bring you back out to where we are here to just show you that, you know, you can go to the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, school business officials. Neighboring school districts are going through similar conversations in their communities. You'll see many districts just pointing out to this fiscal reality that's been a challenge for us all as we try to figure out how to fund Wisconsin schools. And I think if we go to the next slide, we get, yeah. So, you know, obviously that has an effect. In 2002, Wisconsin was, let me move my information here. Wisconsin was ranked about 11 in the nation in terms of per pupil funding. We've seen the largest drop of any state since that time. And then again, this is 2020 data. And in 2020, we had dropped to 25th. And then that 25th ranking is prior to, as it says in the middle there, prior to factoring in the funding freeze of those 2 years of zero that we saw in a row. So fiscal information, gathering that from across the country takes a little time. So this is always kind of a lagging piece of information that is developed. But you would imagine, and we believe it's true, that when this is updated, especially given those 2 years of zero, that unfortunately Wisconsin's ranking will fall even lower than what we've seen here so far. Next slide, please. So what does that mean for MPS? When we talk about that $3,380 per pupil gap and decline, to just put it in basic terms, if you multiply 3,380 against our student enrollment, MPS would have at least $210 million more per pupil had we simply kept pace with inflation, or at least got back on track with inflation and tried to, and had the state kind of re-upped to its commitment to do that. If you're doing your calculator at home and you're multiplying these numbers together, you'll see that actually, you know, the number comes out to greater than $210 million. We're putting that in there because there are some revenue limit worksheet calculations that we do on the DPI website that all districts have to do, and some additional variables that come into play. So that's why we're saying at least 210 million if we had simply had that 3,380 per pupil that we don't have because of that gap. And I'll pause here too to say, when at the beginning of this year, and we've been talking about this problem with the governor, with the legislator, with anybody who's shown up at our school board meetings, you may have heard some of this before, that as we entered this year, and usually actually about a year ago this time is when we really are engaging with our colleagues, other school districts across the state, to make the case for sufficient school funding and frankly basic school funding for our students. What was being asked of the state was to provide $1,510 per pupil over this biennium, over this 2-year period, because we knew and we had information that in those 2 years of zero, and then when the forecast for this year and next year, we needed $1,510 just to stay on track with inflation over that 4-year period of time. And so we made the case to the state that, you know, that is where we are. They saw some of this history. They know some of this history. The information we're sharing with you tonight comes from the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, which keeps track of this history. So just I'm saying that to let people know that we have been working, and many districts have been working, and you may have yourself been advocating and heard about the $1,510 need to get into this budget. And we saw the 325, which, you know, is lower than that ask that we had at the time. So we can go to the next slide. So the other major piece of funding. There are other major pieces of funding, but as I said, with regard to categorical aids, funding for students with disabilities is something that the state is obligated to provide constitutionally. If you want to go look up Article 10 of the Wisconsin State Constitution, the state holds itself to a standard to provide a sound basic education and then defines what that means. And the state Supreme Court has ruled that the state must also make sure to fund different categories of students who may need additional support. And one of the major categorical aid areas is special education. And at one time, the state of Wisconsin reimbursed costs to districts at about close to 70%, and then fell as far as 25% a couple of years back. And right now is hovering around that 31% mark. Whenever we have this conversation, whenever any school district has this conversation, we always pause and make it 100% clear that we are providing services to students with disabilities no matter what. We're pointing out the fiscal pressure that the state is creating here, but we would provide the support needed. We actually have, I would say, and frankly, there's been external reviews of our folks. We have some wonderful people working with our students, especially coming out of the stresses of COVID. And we would do that work anyway. So just want to, repeat that we provide services to students, but the fact that the state has fallen back on its commitment to fund students means that all school districts then have to take resources from other areas to make sure that that area is provided for. So when you combine the inflationary adjustment, and when we look at special education funding, those are two areas in this last budget that we really advocated for. Again, locking arms with the rural school districts, our suburban neighbors, everybody, because this has an impact across the state. So, right now we're at 31%. You may have heard, for example, that private schools that participate in the special needs scholarship program get a minimum 90% reimbursement. And there's been a Blue Ribbon Commission report that came out 4 or 5 years ago now. This was a commission put together by the legislature to review K-12 education funding. And they had a panel of elected officials and some members from the education community that they brought on board, traveled across the state, really dug in and did some very hard work, good work, analyzing where the state was with regard to funding students, and then made a set of recommendations to themselves, essentially, where they themselves recommended meeting a 60% reimbursement rate. So this is in the Blue Ribbon Commission report, where the legislature essentially has recommended to itself that they should meet that level. They also recommended again to themselves that they reestablish funding that keeps pace with inflation. So it's, really what we're pointing out today is factually what the legislature already knows, along with the fact, and I was reminded of this as we were kind of going through this presentation, that even beyond these basic areas of funding, that commission recommended additional funding for English learning students, and recommended putting in place funding to support students who are challenged by the barriers of poverty, which is not uncommon in other states. So even if we add those pieces in, and this is statewide, the state is about $780 million behind its own recommendations to support students challenged by poverty, and another $120 million behind the recommendation to support English learners. So, we could kind of go down the line with the other parts of those recommendations, but we're just really trying to spell out that these issues have been studied, solutions have been articulated, we have advocated for these solutions, And at least in this most recent state budget, not all those solutions have come to pass. And as you may have seen in an article yesterday again, and probably have heard over the course of time here, the state has a surplus. And when you put together the kind of the basic surplus with what they call the rainy day fund, all told, the state right now has about $6 billion in its coffers. And the price of getting to 60% reimbursement for 1 year is about $460 million. So the state could, if it chose to, move forward in funding that 60% level. The governor had proposed that in his original budget, and we are now in state law have a recommendation of 33%. But because of the way things work out, right, we're hovering around 31%. So we'll see if we even get to that 33. So just again, I know this is a lot of information, many numbers here, but if you just take those two primary areas that we've highlighted, the roughly 210 million had we kept pace with inflation, and the 55 million is what we would have. Thank you. We would have approximately 55 million more today if the state provided that 60% reimbursement level. So you just add 210 with the 55, and in those two areas alone, we would have resources of 265 million, probably a little higher, that we don't unfortunately have today. So as we're talking about, where have these fiscal pressures come from? Have we had discussions about the needs? We certainly have worked strongly with our partners who have been excellent. But I think if you probably went to any district around Wisconsin, you would, and actually you could probably look up videos similar to this, where school districts are making presentations about their specific needs and this same history. These elements have come together to basically put us where we are today. And we do not anticipate, again, they've just decided the state budget. At this moment, we don't anticipate them coming back into a special session or anything like that to take action. So as we sit here in December, with all of this background, we are, dealing with some of the fiscal challenges that we will be talking about this evening. Let's go to the next slide. And this is just to give you, some additional affirmation of that. We've had research from the Wisconsin Policy Forum. If you want to go to the Wisconsin Policy Forum, they have an education section. You can type in special education if you want your own documentation of the history of the underfunding of special education. And we can certainly provide additional links and resources to help provide more information if you want it, if you want to share any of this with your friends, neighbors, colleagues. But just wanted to throw this in there to represent the fact that there's a lot of information out there. We even saw a recent, I think a couple days ago, another study by the Wisconsin Policy Forum showing that teacher salaries are behind the rate of inflation as well. So the documentation over time of these fiscal challenges, if you're logging in tonight, is I'm guessing something you may have already seen, but we just really wanted to provide some of this background information to help people understand the state side of this conversation and the continued need. We're going to keep advocating for funds, obviously, and keep having our conversations. But we are in this particular moment because of the detail that I've provided here tonight. So I'm hopeful that's helpful to give you a little background. And we can go to the next slide. So with that as kind of the history and laying out what the state situation is, we now are confronted at the local level of really taking on what all of that means for us here at Milwaukee Public Schools. So our finance team finalized our last budget at the end of October, and has now been turning its attention really to the detail of what all that means as we look ahead. And Nick Sinram from our finance office is going to help explain really what the challenges are here for MPS as we're looking into the weeks and months ahead. So I'll turn over to Nick.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for all of that, putting all that context into play for us. So I know that was a lot. Well, sorry, let me introduce myself again. My name is Nick Sinram. I'm the Director of Financial Planning and Budget Services for the Milwaukee Public School District. I know that's a lot. There's a lot of information there. You all are probably more familiar than maybe others of the average member of the public, but it's still a lot. So feel free to ask questions in the chat or do some research with the information that we've provided. But now I want to try and take that very kind of complicated context and historical narrative and tell you what does that mean for Milwaukee Public Schools and our students. So the four kind of broad categories that I'm going to discuss tonight is first, our district budget shortfall. That's for the FY25 school year. I know that that is why you're here tonight. So thank you for being here and giving up your time on an evening to help provide us with your input. It's so very important to us that we get community feedback and community input so that we can make sure we are doing right by our parents, our students, and all of Milwaukee. So the second topic that I'll discuss are the drivers of financial challenges. And these vary. Some of them are very complex. Some of them will be very relatable to you, as all Americans, really people around the world are trying to cope with increased inflation that we've experienced in the last few years. Like we have to be able to balance, like your home budget, we have to be able to balance our budget. A tool that we use and put together to do that are our 5-year budget projections. So we'll go into kind of a high level and also some detail of those 5-year budget projections. And then finally, probably the most important aspect of tonight is that we want to provide you with some of the options that are possible solutions, or at least partial solutions, and get your input on what's important to you and to help guide our decision-making process through those options. And again, this is all to try and drive home, what this complicated statewide pattern of funding means for our school district, for our students, for your children. So the big takeaway is that if state funding had kept up with inflation, instead of having 210 million additional funds per year, in fact, MPS is facing a budget shortfall for fiscal year 2025 of at least 200 million. And now that doesn't even include the shortfall for special ed funding, English language learners, students in poverty. So we felt that this was a fairly conservative benchmark for us to highlight for the public and for state decision makers. And so again, it's $210 million additional funds if state funding had kept up with inflation. And that's every single year. So that is an awful lot of money. Some of the driving factors of our financial challenges, again, we have touched in depth on the first three. Revenue limits, which is again the state law from the 90s that ties our hands in terms of how much funds can we raise to support our students. And I think we've made a compelling case that we believe that these revenue limits, while maybe well-intentioned, are no longer working in the way that they were meant to, and are preventing us from supporting our students in the way that we believe that they deserve. And I think you would agree. The second factor would be inflation. Now I know that this is very relatable to most people. As you're balancing your household budgets, if your salaries or revenues don't keep up with the rate of inflation, you are essentially getting paid less every year. And so I know that is a real crunch for a lot of people, and it's been a crunch for the district as well, and school districts all around the country, and especially in the state of Wisconsin. Third factor that is worth noting is, again, the lack of special education funding. And I think Chris did a great job of laying out, the fact that we do still continue to provide services for all of our students, including students with disabilities or special needs. That is state, federal law, and it's the right thing to do. And we do that, but it strains the funding and resources that we have to be able to fund other areas of our services. So it's a real challenge. Next, the fourth factor that we want to highlight for you is our salary and personnel costs. Like most businesses, organizations, everyone knows that we are in the midst of a very tight job market, and there are labor shortages. You've probably seen that in your favorite restaurants. Maybe if you're trying to hire a carpenter or someone to do maintenance work. But for us, what that means is teacher and staff shortages. And this is a trend that is really a nationwide trend. We currently have nationwide teacher shortage, and that's true of Wisconsin as well. So the solution that we see is to be able to attract and retain teachers so that they can continue to provide the educational services in the classroom, in our schools, for our students, is that we need to be as competitive as possible so that we are able to hire teachers and keep teachers so that they can continue to teach your children. And I know that is, of course, always a challenge, but without being able to retain teachers, we would lose teachers to other employment opportunities and really be in a tough spot. So for us, what that means is that we need to be competitive with salaries. And again, these are not raises. These are cost of living adjustments. Teachers nationwide the salaries have not kept up with inflation, and we are trying to avoid that phenomenon here in the district. Additionally, another large driver for our costs are benefits. Public service often attracts people because of strong benefit packages, but those are increasingly difficult to maintain. So it's very much a strong recruitment factor, but it is a challenge, and it is a driver of our financial situation, our financial challenges. I also want to highlight for you that here at MPS, we do experience a pretty significant cost to maintain our aging facilities. Schools on average are at least 80 years old. And so, you can imagine, especially, if you've been in your home for a while, that with time, costs to maintain buildings, maintain your infrastructure, it adds up. You can imagine that there's always needs for not only major projects like asbestos remediation, ADA improvements, but everyday projects, just keeping the lights on, painting keeping boilers working. There are increasingly expensive costs with aging facilities. And here in the district, many of our buildings, as I said, are 80 years old, or maybe even older. The final point that I'd like to highlight for you is the daily transportation costs. Here in the district, we transport students to and from school, both regular ed and special education students, and it's daily 40,000 students. Just take a moment to wrap your head around that number. I grew up in a town of approximately 10,000 people. So every day, we are driving multiple towns worth of students twice a day. So it's a major cost. It's a great service, but it is definitely a challenge, and it definitely drives our financial situation. Here you'll see a very detailed breakdown. And again, I apologize. I know this is a lot. We wanted to provide as much detail as possible without overwhelming people. This is very complex, but it's something that you can reference if you decide you want to do a little bit more digging. So first, I'll just kind of orientate you to the slide here. So these are 5-year projections that we produce every year. Now, this one was produced in January of 2023. So this is a little dated. We release our projections every January. And currently that's on the top of our list. We're working on that right now, and we'll be providing that to the board in January and to the public. So it's all publicly available. You can see that if you look from left to right in the columns, in the vertical columns, you'll see current years and then 5 years worth of projected expenses. And the categories for those expenses are on the left side of the slide. And you'll see all the detail broken out by categories. And I just want to highlight for you this bottom highlighted portion where you see our current projected expenditure or shortfall between revenues and expenditures. Now, mind you, this is from January of 2023. And as we have refined our projections, learned more funding information from the state, seen the challenges from inflation and the tight job market. So those have now increased. You'll see that they're slightly below, but as we put out a revised version, you will see these projections with more detail provided up to the at least $200 million that we've been talking about with you tonight. So again, this is a lot, but if it's there for your reference, if you'd like to do a little bit more digging or share it with anyone that you think might be interested. So then this brings us to our challenge. And this is a challenge that we face every year of balancing the MPS budget. You know, like I've already mentioned, this is very much the same exercise that you do at home with your family for your household budget. You know, we look at revenues coming in and expenditures going out to provide our services. And we try to balance those in order to have, you know, a balanced budget. And really, this is, you know, what's so critical about having you here tonight is that we would like to hear your input on ideas of how we can address the shortfall. So the district needs to balance revenues and expenditures. And again, we'd like your feedback on our options to increase funding and decrease costs. And specifically, we will have a survey at the end that allows you to do that. And we would really appreciate your feedback. So here are some things that MPS is doing, has done, will continue to do in order to address the state funding shortfall. We first really focus heavily on legislative advocacy. This is led by Chris and continues. You know, we give all sorts of volunteers, activists, people who are daily writing their legislature, trying to advocate for an increase in funding. One of our big recent pushes was that we joined school districts across the state to ask for more funding in the 2023-24 school year to help address inflation. I want to echo what Chris said, that of course we appreciate the increase that the state provided us in state aid. However, unfortunately, it's just not enough to make up for the increasing costs from inflation. Our second activity that I'd like to focus you on is our strategic planning. We do 5-year strategic plans. Every 5-year strategic plan addresses, or this year's 5-year strategic plan addresses right sizing the district, enhanced budget outreach, and a few other projects that Mr. Galvan mentioned earlier that would help streamline operations and hopefully find cost savings. Finally, similar to tonight, we work hard to get community feedback and engagement. We do this formally through annual budget meetings, public hearings, news releases, and other communications. We also share, as I mentioned already, our 5-year budget projection every January. It's publicly available on the website, on our district website. You can access historical projections and do a little bit more digging there if you're interested. Here is some budget saving measures that we've taken. And again, we've taken them. We will continue to take them in the future, but these are our attempts to reduce expenditures. This is an annual process. We are always trying to control costs, trying to do more with less because of inflation. But we'd like to just take an opportunity to point out something that I think we're all very proud of. And that is that we invest, the Milwaukee Public Schools invests 94%. So that's 94 cents of every dollar of taxpayer dollars directly into our classrooms. And so again, I'll just repeat that because I know I'm proud of it, that 94% of all of our funding is used in our classrooms for educational services for our students. In 2019, we increased that. Well, we increased to that. In 2019, we made a very conscious effort under Superintendent Dr. Posley to divert central office funds back into the schools, put those funds to even better use, And so that is how we reach 94% of every dollar going right into our classrooms. Another step that we take is to minimize borrowing and aggressively repaying debt. Of course, there are borrowing costs that come with any time you take out a loan. And especially, if you have recently purchased a home, sold a home, taken out a car loan, you'll know that right now we are near record high interest rates. And so by minimizing our borrowing and paying what relatively little borrowing we do have owed aggressively, we are avoiding interest costs that help save money over the long term. And those are avoided costs every year. So it's definitely something that we work hard to minimize our borrowing and aggressively repay debt. Another thing that I'd like to highlight is that we make a very conscious effort to provide shared services. And what I mean by this is partnering with community organizations to maximize the utilization of taxpayer dollars. And so, essentially we have become roommates and partners with a lot of great community organizations working through Milwaukee and around the state to help provide even better educational services by bringing in, a variety of perspectives, a variety of talents and experiences. And so one, practical example is that we often work with local community organizations to share space in our buildings. And so if there is maybe a alder person who wants to host a community meeting, we share that space and they help support some of those costs. If a local group wants to use a gym or an auditorium, we frequently partner with those groups, and they very generously help support some of the operational costs to use those facilities. And then finally on this slide, we work hard in the Office of Finance and across the district to maintain fiscally responsible practices. And proof of this is that we've retained a high bond rating and therefore further reduced potential borrowing costs. And if you can review our financial audit, it's an annual audit that confirms that this is true. So this slide I want to discuss with you, and I know we've touched on this already quite a bit, but just to really drive home, the limited options that Wisconsin school districts have to raise revenue. And this is true for us. This is true for other urban districts, suburban districts, rural districts. It is, across the state, true almost to every single district. The vast majority of funding, as we've said, comes from state aid and property tax levy. In Milwaukee, or for Milwaukee Public Schools, we expect that state aid in the fiscal year 25 will actually decrease by up to $10 million. This is an estimate. It is based on our state's very complex revenue limit formula, but we feel pretty confident with that projection. So that is we have no control, or at least very, very limited control over state funding. Another lever that we have that we can pull, although this is not an easy lever to pull, is enrollment. So as we discussed, Wisconsin, a large portion of our funding is based off of our per pupil state aids. And so, this means that we get funding for every student attending our classes. Well, fortunately, MPS's enrollment has stabilized. However, unfortunately, this is not really a realistic lever to address our current shortfall. Even if we are able to increase enrollment, it may not increase our revenue due to the state funding formula. And I'd like to point out that increasing enrollment is a really challenging prospect, really challenging task to tackle. School enrollment is decreasing around the state. It's decreasing around the nation. And because of demographic changes, we don't expect that to drastically change, or at least not enough that it would reverse this shortfall. The reality is that families are having less children, and they're having these children later in life. And so that limits the amount of students who are in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, and able to attend our schools. The third and final lever that we have is a referendum. And so a referendum is, essentially going to take a vote and asking the public, the residents of city of Milwaukee specifically for us, to raise the revenue limit, which would then allow for an increase in property taxes. And I would just like to point out how this works is that it is noticeable in the first year, but actually over the long run, the tax burden would not be as steep as when we increase our expenditures in later years, we will get a greater portion of our funding from state aid rather than local property taxes. So referendums are very common. They're utilized by schools and governments all around the country. Since 1994, 82% of Wisconsin school districts have asked voters to exceed state-imposed revenue limits with referenda. Referenda is the plural form of referendum, so fun fact. In 2022, it was the highest year for referenda in Wisconsin history, and 80% passed. So, it is definitely a tough choice for voters to make, but I think overwhelmingly, people tend to value the services, educational services for their children and for their neighbors' children. Many districts are experiencing budget shortfalls. Again, this is around the country and especially in Wisconsin. And we are currently considering school closures, referenda, or both. This is very common. You'll probably read in the newspaper. There are many school districts, again, many of whom are our neighboring friends in suburban and rural schools that are resorting to referendum. So here is another very important slide that I really want to focus you on. If I've lost your attention, please come back to us, because this is where we want to share some of our opportunities for reducing expenditures with you and get your feedback through our survey. So the first option would be to reduce funding to schools. We receive our funding from the state and then distribute it amongst our schools. And we know that will have real life impacts on the services that we will provide. It could mean less teachers, higher class sizes, doing without supplies. However it shakes out, schools will have to cope with reduced funding to schools. Another option would be to eliminate district-wide specialty programs. And so what I'm referring to here are, our very exciting, popular programs. We have Montessori programs, international baccalaureate, dual language and language immersion, technology and STEM related. So these are, really exciting programs, and hopefully we're able to maintain those services. Another possible lever that we have is to reduce mental health supports and to our students. And, we don't take that decision lightly. We know that, it's like anyone, students often need mental health help, and especially in coping with the impacts of the pandemic. So that is an option. We could certainly look to delay replacement cycles for repairs, educational materials, technology improvements. And by delay replacement cycles, what I mean by that is that school districts, businesses, probably you at home, you plan for how long you think like your computer is going to last. And so we set up cycles for maybe every so many years we have to replace textbooks. Every so many years we phase in replacing Chromebooks, computers throughout the district. And so while this is an option to potentially limit our expenditures, it's not a permanent solution. We know that eventually we have to replace computers, we have to replace textbooks, but it is an option. The next bullet point is to reduce personnel costs. So unfortunately, this means eliminating positions that are vacant and potentially going ahead with layoffs. Now, I want to make sure to emphasize that this is our absolute last choice here that we would want to have to make. But unfortunately, that's just the reality that we are in. All options are on the table. Additionally, we are looking at potentially freezing salaries And so again, that would mean limiting cost of living adjustments. And I just want to point out that that term is not a raise. That is it's just an adjustment for teachers and staff to keep their salaries up with inflation and be their current level. Finally, the next item would be to increase employee costs for benefits. That would mean paying more for healthcare and other benefits that help attract employees. We are also looking at consolidating schools, potentially closing schools. However, this is an option that is maybe not going to be as strong of a solution as some people might envision. There's significant opportunity costs to closing schools, consolidating schools. The real value is that it would potentially improve educational services, get qualified experts, in the classroom and in front of our students. We could also look at reducing transportation. And we know that this also has real world impacts in terms of limiting the choices that families would have for school options because of just the practical reality of getting their child to school. And finally, we are, of course, considering increasing funding for the district through a referendum. But again, these are all options that, we're trying to give a variety of options, and we want your input on where your priorities are and where do you think we could do less of realistically. So here I'll direct you to our survey. If you could please take this time to fill that out. You can either access it through the QR code or the survey link that was provided in the flyer and on the website. And thank you again for being here and for making time, taking time out of your day to help us with this shortfall and this challenge.
Once again, I do want to thank everybody who has participated and obviously the panel for sharing this information. We are quickly approaching our 6:30 end time. I did want to reiterate that again, we do want to have all the input possible. We will be compiling all of these and questions from the chat as well and comments, and that will be again posted on the webpage and a frequently asked question page. Again, I do want to remind everybody that we also have available on this coming Saturday at Milwaukee High School of the Arts, 2300 West Highland Avenue, from 10 to 11, another one of these sessions. The information will be the same, but it will be in a different format in that it will be in person. So there will be a little bit more opportunity for some back and forth. I do want to at least go to one question to the panel before we get to 6:30, but there was a question in regards to what about the ESSER funding and money from the previous referendum? If one, Ms. Kreitzman, thank you.
Hello, I'm Martha Kreitzman, Chief Financial Officer, and thank you everyone for being here and sticking with us. About the ESSER funding and the referendum. ESSER was short-term funding to help mitigate the impact of the pandemic. The funding was available for a couple of years. While it was a substantial amount of funding, with the underfunding of education in Wisconsin, what it really did for Milwaukee Public Schools was provide us with a standard that should be normal, not short-term. ESSER helped the district with accelerating learning, health and wellness, facilities, technology, and extracurricular engagement. These are all things that we would want for our students. There were 3 ESSER funding waves, and ESSER 1 and 2 are expended. Funding is left for ESSER 3, which has been budgeted, partially expended, and ends September 30th, 2024. Therefore, that funding will not be able to help us in the 2024-25 ongoing costs. And the referendum, we're grateful that in the spring of 2020, the taxpayers approved a referendum for MPS of $87 million, which was phased in over 4 years. This current year, we received $3 million in extra funding for the last year of phase-in. Unfortunately, The way the revenue limit works, due to non-regular increases in the revenue limit, our funding has actually decreased since the beginning of that referendum. We have kept our commitment to budget those dollars to support early childhood education and reduce class size, attracting and retaining certified educators, professional support staff such as psychologists, social workers, school counselors, meeting educational standards for programming in library, art, music, and physical education, expanding access to advanced educational programming opportunities, comprehensive career and technical education. The state seems to have referendum as the funding formula for districts. In 2022, during a time when there were ESSER funds available, more school districts than ever in Wisconsin went out for referendum and succeeded. There were 166 referendum requests put on ballots, 133 of those passed. The lack of funding is not just an MPS situation.
Thank you, Ms. Kreitzman. We are at the end of our time. Please know that, again, your feedback and these questions will be taken into consideration. We will be, again, compiling all of this. This meeting was recorded. As I mentioned at the beginning, we did have an earlier session today, a virtual session, and some other questions were asked and answered. Those are recorded and will be made available. Again, we will also be holding a meeting this coming Saturday, again, 10 to 11 at Milwaukee High School of the Arts, 2300 West Highland Avenue. You have a survey link that is there, QR code. We have a email that is dropped into the chat where you can also provide feedback and ask questions, which would also be responded to and posted. Again, I want to thank you all for taking time from your busy days to be with us, and look forward to seeing hopefully some of you on Saturday, and or obviously complete the survey and provide your feedback in all the ways that we've outlined for you. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.